A cup placed in the same spot again and again is not just an object at rest, but a moment quietly repeated, a habit made sacred through the gentleness of ritual and the absence of change. This single act, so small it nearly disappears into the fabric of a quiet life, carries within it the weight of time, of memory, of unspoken promise. The cup may be plain ceramic, perhaps off-white with a faint hairline crack on one side or a glaze that once shone, but now bears the soft dullness of daily use. Its handle may be worn where fingers have curled around it, familiar with the touch, like a handshake between person and object that has occurred more times than can be remembered. And yet, despite its simplicity, or perhaps because of it, the cup has become more than its purpose. Its placement, each day, in the same corner of the table, on the same faint ring etched into the wood, has transformed it from a vessel into a symbol. It is not dramatic, not ostentatious. It asks for no notice, no praise, but it becomes, with each gentle setting down, a quiet guardian of continuity in a world that shifts too easily, too often. The person who places it, whether with deliberate care or from muscle memory, may no longer register the act as meaningful, but meaning doesn't require attention to exist. In fact, the most tender meanings often grow where attention fades, taking root in consistency and silence. The cup may be placed as the morning light stretches across the kitchen floor, touching that corner of the table like a blessing. That light shifts through seasons, golden and lazy in late summer, pale and cold in the depths of winter. But the cup remains, catching the sun like a quiet sentinel. Perhaps once, it was part of a matching set, but those others have long since been broken, gifted away, or hidden in cabinets never opened. This one cup remained, not because it was the finest or strongest, but because it stayed through busy mornings, quiet afternoons, and restless evenings. And now, it holds more than liquid. It holds presence. It holds proof. It holds time. The table bears witness to, its surface stained with age and soft indentations where elbows once rested, or where the cup itself has warmed the wood again and again. Maybe nearby, there's a chair that's always pulled out slightly, as though expecting someone. Maybe the room is quiet, filled only with the hum of a refrigerator, or the occasional distant birdsong or passing car, and in the quiet, the placement of the cup is its own kind of music, a rhythm known only to the one who moves through the room. There is no need for words here. The act is enough, and over time, it becomes a declaration. I was here. I am still here. I will return again. And that returning, however quiet, becomes powerful. For in a world where so much is lost, changed, or forgotten, the cup remains where it has always been, cradled in the curve of morning like a held breath. Maybe, once, the cup was placed there by someone else, someone who is now gone, whose habits remain like footprints in dust. Or maybe it was always yours, and the routine grew out of your hands like ivy, slow and unnoticed, until you could no longer imagine a morning beginning without that simple choreography. Walk into the room, lift the cup, fill it, place it down. Perhaps some mornings, the cup is not used, only touched, moved slightly, then returned. Even on those days, its role is unchanged. It is there to be part of the morning. It is there to mark that you, too, were present. Sometimes, the world is too loud, too fast, too much, and this cup, this one small constancy, becomes an anchor, something to come back to when everything else has turned uncertain. It does not care whether your hands are steady or trembling, whether your mind is sharp or clouded. It will sit quietly, where it always has, waiting to be touched again. Even if the room changes, the walls repainted, the chairs replaced, the photos on the refrigerator rotated, the spot for the cup remains untouched, a sacred little patch of stillness amid the movement of life. In this way, the cup becomes an act of devotion, not to coffee or tea, but to presence, to habit, to care. Some might call it meaningless, this act of placing a cup in the same spot each day. But those who live quietly know the meaning doesn't shout. It whispers. It hums under the surface. It settles into the skin like warmth after rain. The person who places the cup might not remember when the habit began, Perhaps it started during a time of grief, when the world felt like it was shifting under their feet and they needed one thing, just one, to stay still. Or maybe it began during a time of joy when mornings were slow and filled with light and love, and the cup marked the time, like a bookmark slipped between the pages of a favorite novel. Or maybe it started with no intention at all, just a practical moment that deepened with repetition. Either way, the result is the same. A history has settled in that spot. A history that does not need to be told because it is lived day after day. In the sound of ceramic on wood, in the feel of fingers around a handle, and in the slight pause before the cup is set down, and the world begins again. One day, the cup may break. That is the truth of all things touched and used and loved. But the gesture will remain. The hand may reach for the place even when it is empty. The eye may glance to the corner of the table before the mind remembers the absence. But absence is a shape made by memory, and memory keeps company with habit. So even in loss, there is a form of presence. Another cup may take its place, or not. Maybe the hand will grow tired of lifting, the routine interrupted by age or change. But for a long time still, the trace of the cup will remain. The mark on the wood, the pause in the step, the light still lands in the same way, as though waiting for something to be placed again. And maybe, someday, someone else will notice. A child grown older, a visitor return. They will see that spot and remember or ask. And in the asking, the story will be told. That's where she always put her cup. And the room will nod in silent agreement, because rooms remember. The cup will be gone, but the story will remain not in words, but in placement, in pause, in the gentle choreography of daily life. And isn't that, in the end, what we all hope for? That's something we did quietly and without fanfare might echo softly after we're gone, not in thunder, but in the way morning light lands, in the pause before a cup is set down, and in the reverence of repetition. A cup placed in the same spot is not a habit. It is a ceremony. It is a memory in motion. It is a love that doesn't need to explain itself. It is a quiet kind of permanence in a world that changes too much. And even if no one else notices, even if no one else remembers, the act remains real. The cup was placed, the hand moved, the morning began, and the stillness, like the cup, stayed. There was a window on the far wall of a room that most would forget, an unassuming rectangle of glass, framed in aging wood so ordinary in shape and placement that it might have escaped notice altogether had it not been the only thing in the room that insisted on never changing. It did not bow to trends or seasons or repaintings of the walls around it. It simply stayed steady, a silent observer of the same narrow scene it had offered for as long as anyone could remember. Through it, there was no grand horizon, no bustling street, and no body of water that mirrored the sky, just a sloping stretch of earth, a weather-beaten fence that leaned slightly from the weight of forgotten seasons, a small tangle of overgrown ivy clinging where no one asked it to, and a tree, not a magnificent one, just a tree, quietly tall, with branches that never seemed to grow wider or sparser but that trembled gently whenever the wind wandered past. The road that dipped behind the barn at the edge of sight never grew wider, was never paved, and was never busy. It did not offer mystery, really, just the comfort of continuity. Time passed here in undramatic intervals. Grass yellowed and greened. Snow came and went. The sky bruised itself with storm clouds and then cleared again. But the structure of the scene never altered. Nothing ever built itself into this frame, and nothing ever left it. The view remained intact even when the world beyond the house did not. And inside the quiet room with its worn wooden floor and walls the color of pages long kept in an attic, the same view had been watched, unchanging, by generations of lives that passed in and out like breath. Once, children had run through this space, their fingers smudging the lower glass, their laughter echoing briefly before disappearing into the hall. Later, those children grew older, and their play was replaced with quiet hours, moments of sitting, looking out, not searching for anything in particular, just watching. There were cups of tea left on window sills, sometimes half finished, their steam rising into morning light that spread across the room like butter on bread. There were letters open in that chair, and journals written in careful script, and sometimes left open as though the thoughts hadn't quite ended. There were visitors, too, who stood politely for a moment and glanced out the window, murmuring some vague remark about how peaceful it all was, as if peace were a thing to be named quickly and then moved past. But the window didn't respond to such moments. It remained indifferent to admiration and untouched by commentary. It didn't change its view for anyone. Even the seasons, dramatic as they could be elsewhere, arrived here quietly. Spring crept in not with parades of bloom, but with a subtle warming of color in the leaves, and a slight softening of the ground. Summer buzzed outside the glass with lazy insects and the occasional drifting dandelion. Autumn turned the tree a tired amber, the kind of gold that knew how to fade gracefully. And winter muffled everything in gentle whites and silvers, the kind of silence that settled deeper than sound. And still, the window did not blink. Even when storms came, yes, they did come, it did not become a portal to chaos. The rain ran down it like melted memory, and thunder throbbed somewhere far behind the hills. But the frame held. It always held. Perhaps that is why the final person who remained in the house came to sit by it more and more, not out of obligation or boredom, but because it asked for nothing. It didn't offer answers or reminders or demands. It offered presence. In a world where everything else changed, where the face in the mirror grew older, where the sound of steps softened into slower rhythms, where voices stopped arriving through phones or doors, the window remained a faithful companion. It did not pity, it did not advise, it did not reflect grief or joy. It simply offered what it always had, that small, unchanging view. And the person who sat there learned to lean into the constancy. They learned to greet the fence each morning like an old friend, to note the way the light fell across the ivy, and to sense the way the wind moved through the upper branches of the tree. Sometimes, they whispered things aloud, memories that no one else was around to hear. Names, dates, little jokes. Sometimes a sigh would rise in the room like smoke from a candle just extinguished, not dramatic. Just the slow release of a thought that had nowhere left to go. And the window stayed, even when time frayed at the edges of memory. Even when days became indistinguishable and meals forgotten and the pages of calendars no longer mattered, the window offered the same. It did not rush. It did not remind. It only held space. And in doing so, it became sacred in a way that nothing loud or new or exciting ever could. It became a quiet altar of sorts, where the ordinary was allowed to matter, where the daily act of sitting and watching became a kind of devotion. It was through this window that grief passed quietly, first for parents, then for siblings, and later for friends whose letters stopped arriving. It was through this window that loneliness arrived, not all at once, but as a series of subtle absences. An unopened birthday card, a silence on a Sunday. A chair was no longer pulled close to the table, but the window didn't echo loneliness. It absorbed it gently, softened it. It allowed those things to be felt without being magnified. It gave permission to continue breathing even when breathing felt like the only thing left to do. Eventually, even the rituals around it faded. The teacup remained, but went unused. The blanket on the chair was no longer tucked just so. The journal stopped being open, and still, the window watched, still. It framed the same eternal picture. The fence, the ivy, the lane, the tree. The view did not know how to abandon, and so, when the final moment came, not with a gasp, but a settling, not with drama, but with the gentle descent of breath into stillness, it was the window that bore witness. The window that had seen everything and judged nothing. That had held birthdays and tears and holidays and grief and laughter and silence in equal weight. That had kept its gaze not because it was instructed to, but because that was its nature, to be present. The room quieted entirely, as if the house itself had inhaled once more and decided to hold the breath forever. Outside, the tree did not mourn. The fence did not lean further. The lane remained empty, and still, the window did its work. It watched. It held. It offered the same view it always had, with no need to change now or ever. It was not a window, really. It was a story that never needed rewriting, a prayer spoken without words, a frame for the kind of peace that comes not from stilling the world, but from learning to rest quietly within it. A lesson, too, for anyone who might someday sit in that chair and wonder if the view would ever change, and perhaps come to understand that it never needed to, because the world does not always need to rush forward to be meaningful. Sometimes the most important truths are those we look at every day without realizing until one day we do. There was a hallway, long and still and made of wood that no longer remembered how to creak, because it had heard every sound it would ever need to hear and now chose not to respond. The grain of the floor had once been vibrant, polished to a shine and gleaming with footsteps and voices, but now it rested in a warm mat, quiet as though age had gently coaxed it into calmness. Not as a retreat, but as a return. The walls, too, were covered in an old floral paper, faded at the edges, curled slightly in corners, and no longer bold enough to call attention to itself, but content simply to remain. And in this place, this untouched corridor of hushed breath and filtered light, someone walked, slowly, gently, without haste or hesitation, and without drawing a single echo from the world around them. The steps were not heavy, nor were they exaggerated to be silent. They were simply real steps, placed one after another, with the quiet knowledge that not all movement needs to be declared. There was no click of a heel, no soft shuffle of fabric, and no tap or creak or flutter. The space did not yield its stillness for this presence, but neither did it resist. It simply allowed the passage without comment, without sound, like a memory being recalled so many years after the fact, that even its noise had softened away. The person who walked did not glance around nervously and did not lean forward, as if anticipating an interruption. They were familiar with this place in a way that came not from frequent visits, but from long memory, from the way something lodges in you, not in your mind exactly, but in your posture, in the rhythm of your breath, and in the quiet way you carry your hands. The hallway did not need to recognize the walker, and the walker did not need to be recognized. They belonged to each other in the way morning belongs to mist, or silence belongs to dusk, inevitable, soft, and real without needing to prove itself. Dust hung in the air, but did not stir, floating like a moved time, suspended particles of stillness rather than dirt, as if the very air had resigned itself to stillness and refused even the suggestion of a breeze. There were windows tall and slender, with glass just cloudy enough to keep the outside world at bay, and through them light filtered, and not bold sunlight, not a golden blaze, but a diffuse pale illumination that carried no warmth and no sharpness, only the suggestion of a day continuing somewhere far off. Light settled on the wood like breath on glass, softening edges and muting definition, as if reality itself had become unsure of its outlines. The footsteps moved through it all like a poem whispered too low to catch fully, just a presence, a possibility, the curve of a story rather than its details. Not one painting on the wall shifted, not one shadow blinked. It wasn't just the floor that didn't echo. The air itself seemed to absorb and accept the movement as something already accounted for, as though, long ago, the house had heard every voice, every laugh, every argument, every slammed door, and had decided it was full, and from that fullness had grown quiet. And so now, when someone walked through, it did not need to respond. It did not need to echo. The silence was not empty, it was saturated. It was filled with the exact shape of everything that had ever happened and no longer needed to be said again. The walker, perhaps young, perhaps old, did not press fingers to the walls or stop to inspect the faded frames. Their arms hung gently, relaxed, perhaps brushing fabric, perhaps not. There was no memory of being chased here, only acknowledgement. Each step was like an inhale, each space between like an exhale. Even the smallest action, the turn of a shoulder, the tilt of a head, felt as though it had happened many times before. The doors that lined the hallway were all closed, not ominously, but respectfully, as though everything behind them had earned its rest. Some bore signs of wear, chipped paint, softened brass, and a scratch that once had a story but now only had a texture. The walker never paused at these doors, because their presence here wasn't about uncovering or disturbing. It was about walking through the silence and letting it remain intact. Somewhere else in the house, perhaps, a clock existed, ticking its way through time. But here, in this narrow corridor, no such thing made itself known. Time had ceased to measure forward. Instead, it folded into itself. Like linen long put away but not forgotten, the walker's feet knew where to fall, not because the route was planned, but because the space between each step had already been shaped by long past repetition. This was not a walk taken once, but one taken many times over. So many that the space now recognized the rhythm and simply responded with acceptance. And still, there was no echo. The hallway did not need to answer back. The silence here was not void, but a kind of agreement. I know you're here, and I will hold your presence without fuss, without fanfare, without reflecting it back at you. There was no fear in the silence. It did not threaten or weigh or suffocate, it simply was. Patient and vast and entirely unconcerned with being noticed. The person walking carried something in that stillness, though. Not in their hands, which were empty, or their pockets, which lay undisturbed, but somewhere deeper. In the way they did not look over their shoulder, in the way their eyes did not flick to the windows, or doors, or any place at all really. Their gaze was steady, not fixed on a point, but anchored in a state. It was the look of someone who knew the path even when it changed, who had walked it enough to stop looking for it. Somewhere behind them, if one had followed, one might find no trace, no scuff, no dent, no pressed down dust, as if even the floor had decided that remembering the footfall wasn't necessary. Not because it didn't matter, but because it had mattered, and that was enough. The presence of the walker did not interrupt the hallway's peace. They did not claim the space, nor withdraw from it. They simply walked within it, as one does with an old friend whose company requires no conversation. There were no disruptions, no distractions. Even the distant hum of electricity or plumbing, so often present in any house, seemed absent here. Or perhaps it was there, but not needed. Perhaps even sound had chosen to take a rest. And in that rest, everything was clearer, not louder, not sharper, just known. It was a quiet that wrapped around rather than pushed against. A quiet that did not require the world to stop, but merely invited one to notice that it already had. And the footsteps, for all their motion, were part of that invitation, not as an interruption, but as a soft punctuation in the ongoing sentence of stillness, as if the house itself were thinking in a slow rhythm, and the footsteps were how it breathed. Not a call for attention, not a cry for meaning, just a simple, continued movement. The kind of presence that remains not because it needs to be seen, but because it understands what it means to stay. There would be no sudden change here, no end waiting around the corner. The walk would continue, or it would pause, and the silence would adjust, as it always had. For long before there were footsteps, there was this hallway, and long after the footsteps ceased, the hallway would remain not empty, but remembered, not echoing, but full, in the still and unassuming corner of a room that no longer held its breath for anything dramatic, where the walls bore the soft hues of age and the air carried the gentle weight of time pressing. Without urgency, the mirror remained quiet, tall, and oddly dignified in its silence. It had once served a purpose that now felt theatrical, to capture, to echo, to offer back the gaze of whoever stood before it, with no judgment, only mimicry. Once it had glinted sharply, and morning light responding eagerly to the rising sun, and to the countless faces that passed before it, from the hurried brushing of a child's hair to the slow meticulous tucking of an old man's collar. There had been laughter in its surface, and tears to a full collection of human moments stored not as memories but as flickers of light and shadow that danced on glass before vanishing. Over time, people changed, as they always do. The woman who used to check her lipstick every morning before work no longer needed to. The man who once combed his thinning hair and searched for signs of youth, and his tired eyes stopped coming. The child who used to make silly faces and fog the glass with his breath grew into someone, Too busy to look inward, slowly, gently, without notice or complaint, the mirror began to be passed by. At first, it showed only the outlines of people moving too quickly to acknowledge themselves. Then eventually no one at all. It wasn't broken, it still could reflect, but there came a day when it simply didn't. No crack marked this moment, no sound signaled its shift. It just stopped, not out of malice, nor malfunction, but as if it had slowly come to understand that being a mirror meant more than just showing back the world, it meant bearing it. The exhaustion of carrying so many eyes, so many expectations, so many silent judgments, had finally culminated not in collapse, but in gentle refusal. It stood there, facing the room, its surface soft now, dulled not with grime, but with absence. The mirror had chosen not to participate anymore, not in vanity, not in observation, not even in the daily passing glance. It had not forgotten how to reflect, but had forgotten why. The act of reflection had become meaningless, a necessary ritual no longer called for. When people noticed, they did so slowly and without words. They turned to check their collar or hair, only to find no image staring back instead. There was a lightness, a faint shimmer, a sort of visual sigh. Where a face should have been was only softness, like fog, like memory, like a forgotten dream that doesn't quite return when called. Some found this unnerving at first, accustomed to constant self-surveillance, but others found comfort, as if free from a tiny, invisible burden. Without reflection, they could simply be. In that room, the need to check, to compare, to judge, melted away. The mirror became not a servant of appearance, but a guardian of peace, of privacy, of a deeper, quieter selfhood untouched by the gaze. Days passed, then seasons. Dust collected along the top edge, but the glass remained clear in its soft way, not reflective, but receptive, like a page that waited without expectation. No one tried to fix it. There was no need. It wasn't broken, it had transcended. Some even wondered, aloud, if it was more than glass now, something imbued with memory or will or weariness. The plant by the window cast no reflection in it. The beams of afternoon light that once stretched boldly across the room now landed in the mirror with a kind of hush, absorbed and diffused rather than reflected. Still, the room felt full not of images, but of presence. People began to use the space differently. They read there, they wept there, they sat in silence. It became a room for returning to oneself without needing to look. The absence of reflection was not a void, but an offering, a space to be unmeasured, unwatched, and duplicated. The mirror, in its choice, had changed the room's purpose. No longer a dressing area or a space of scrutiny. It became a sanctuary, a kind of gentle confession booth where nothing had to be said aloud. And the mirror watched not with eyes or light, but with stillness, with patience, with a kind of knowing that comes not from vision, but from endurance. Over the years, people stopped even expecting to see themselves there. Children were told the story of the mirror. That forgot to reflect, and they whispered to it curiously, asking if it remembered anyone. Some claimed it shimmered more brightly when spoken to softly. One child left flowers on the table below it, and though the petals browned and curled with time, the mirror never showed their decay. It had no interest in change or or progress. It offered only a pause. And in a world addicted to speed, to image, to affirmation and feedback loops of self-regard, that pause became profound. A silent rebellion, a gentle protest, a reminder that perhaps we were never meant to watch ourselves so closely, so constantly. Perhaps some moments are best left unseen, unreflected, quietly lived, and then released. Eventually, as decades passed, the mirror remained while furniture shifted. People moved away or returned older. New coats were hung on old hooks, and still the mirror stood, faithful in its stillness. No image, no echo. No mimicry, just presence. And those who truly understood what it had become would pause before it, not to be seen, but to remember what it meant to be unguarded, to be unobserved, to be real in a way that didn't require confirmation. The mirror that forgot to reflect had not forgotten us. It had simply chosen not to interrupt. And in its silence, we found our own, not an emptiness, but a rest, not a failure, but a gift. The day unfolded not with fanfare nor even the hushed reverence of significance, but with the same familiar weight. It always carried a subtle rhythm of nothing new, and nothing wrong, a quiet that was neither lonely nor filled, but simply there. Morning came as it always did, through the same window that hadn't been cleaned in months, and didn't need to be, for the dust only softened the light, scattering it across the kitchen tiles like memory rather than sunshine. The air was not cold, not warm, but settled, a temperature learned over time, remembered by the walls and the floors and the objects that stayed still. The kettle boiled like it always had, whistling not for attention, but because that's what kettles do, and the sound disappeared into the corners of the home where echoes no longer bounce. The cup chosen from the shelf was the same one used yesterday, not out of sentimentality, but because reaching for another would have asked something extra of the hand. And this day, like all the others, did not ask for variation. The spoon stirred without changing the flavor, a quiet orbit in a liquid, too familiar to surprise. The first sip was neither hot nor cold, neither bitter nor sweet, but it arrived in the mouth like a sentence already heard before. The punctuation already understood, the meaning absorbed long ago. The chair welcomed the same weight it had grown used to, creaking not in protest, but as part of the routine symphony. Like the groan of a door or the hum of the refrigerator and orchestra of domestic life that had no conductor, only memory. There was no agenda, no call to arms, no appointment circled on a calendar. Only the vague whisper of responsibilities that repeated themselves not for purpose, but because they had not yet learned how to stop. A towel was folded again. A floor was swept, though it bore no mess. A curtain was drawn and then let fall, for no particular reason. The same books lined the shelf, spines tilted slightly from the same place they always leaned. Titles long memorized and stories long since read, yet untouched because there is comfort in seeing something that does not change. Even the plants in their pots sat quietly, their leaves not reaching, just resting, having learned from the air around them that nothing here grows fast and everything waits. The door was open only briefly, as though to confirm the outside world still existed, before being gently shut again, not out of fear, nor out of longing, but simply because inside was where the day knew how to be. Time did not move forward here. It circled, tracing the same patterns it had the day before and the day before that, like a compass needle with nowhere left to point. Meals were eaten not for flavor, nor need, but for the steady ritual of lifting fork to mouth, chewing, swallowing, and sighing, not of boredom, but of completion. Even hunger had softened, grown accustomed to a life where desire no longer shouts, but whispers, and often not at all. The clock ticked, yes, but not to count down or to warn. Its ticking was just another pulse in a room that breathed differently now, a slow, deep inhalation that never quite reached the exhale. No messages arrived, no visitors knocked. The phone sat like a paperweight, heavy with disuse, its screen unlit and patient. The sky, visible through the same kitchen window, changed with the sun, but so subtly that it seemed as though the day simply folded into itself, morning into afternoon, into evening, without ever deciding where one began and the other ended. Shadows lengthened like old stories being retold, not for drama, but to keep their shapes from fading. And in all this sameness, and all this repetition, there was something quietly sacred. Not every life is meant to burn bright, to leap and shout and hunger for more. Some lives, some days, are meant to settle like dust on the windowsill, to keep their promises in silence, to echo only what is needed and no more. The television might have played the same channel as yesterday. It sounded a background murmur that no longer needed listening. To the voice on the screen was not a stranger, but not a friend either, just part of the furniture now. Like the chair or the rug or the clock that ticked for its own sake. Light began to dim, not suddenly, but gradually. the way a breath slows after a long walk. The lamp was switched on not because it was needed, but because that's what happens when the light begins to fade. The same blanket was pulled over the same legs. The same sweater, with a hole near the elbow, was worn again. Nothing had torn further. Nothing had mended. It simply remained. Even the aches of the body were familiar, no new pain. Just the same knees that resisted stairs, the same shoulder that twinged in the cold. These, too, had become routine, integrated, expected. The day did not bring grief. It did not offer joy. It passed without asking anything loud, and in that, there was peace, however small. Even the mind, which once roamed, had grown quiet. Its wandering thoughts now loop rather than leap, circling the same old questions with the same quiet shrug at the end. Sleep came not as a reward, but as another step in the pattern. The light was turned off. The blanket was adjusted. The pillow, with its slight indent, remembered the shape of the head it had held for so many nights. The eyes closed not because of exhaustion, but because the day was over, not completed, just past. No one would write of this day. No journal would preserve it. No one would ask, "What happened today?" and receive an answer longer than a shrug. And yet, it mattered not because of what it contained, but because it was. Because sometimes the most human thing is not the striving or the reaching or the dramatic change, but the quiet persistence of simply being. The quiet dignity of a day that passed like the one before it, and the one before that, holding its place in a long, uninterrupted line of moments that all looked alike but, together, build a life that may not be remarkable, but is real, a life that may not be remembered by name, but leaves behind the softness of repetition, the subtle legacy of days that asked for nothing but your breath and gave nothing but their time, a life made not of milestones, but of tea poured again, and lights turned off again, and a body carried through another day not with drama, but with grace. And when morning returns, not with fanfare, but with the quiet creak of floorboards and the low hum of appliances, beginning their loop again, there will be no surprise. The body will rise, slowly. The light will slip in just as it did. The kettle will boil. The same cup will be reached for, and the day will begin like the one before, and the one before that, and that, in itself, will be enough. The clocks still ticked, even when no one looked at them. They hung on walls, sat on dusty shelves, stood upright on mantels in rooms that no longer expected visitors. Their hands moved with perfect rhythm. Each second passed with obedient precision, as if the world still depended on their honesty. But in that place, in that particular stillness, time was no longer something to be measured. It was something that had quietly drifted away, like smoke rising in a cold room. Notice only once it was already gone. The clocks ticked on, unaware that their purpose had grown thin, that no one had stood in front of them for years and asked, "What time is it?" No voices echoed to fill their seconds. No footsteps aligned with their rhythm. They ticked because they always had, not out of urgency, but out of memory. The rhythm had become muscle memory for the room, a pulse faintly audible through walls that remembered warmth and conversation, but had not felt them in a long while. Each tick echoed into silence and returned unanswered. Not hostile silence, but a settled one, a piece shaped like dust motes floating in old light, shaped like curtains that no longer moved even when the windows were open. Some clocks had stopped marking the hours, their batteries long since dead, their hands frozen at nonsensical places to 17, 4:01, 9:36. Time halted mid-thought, but others still moved, relentlessly faithful, as though nothing had changed. And perhaps that was their tragedy. The ticking continued, but the meaning had leaked away. No train needed catching. No meeting was waiting to begin. No child needed waking. No kettle waited for its boil. All the things that time once framed had faded, and the frame remained, now empty, but still insisting. They ticked like hearts with no body to keep alive. There was a grandfather clock in the hallway that chimed each hour with unwavering devotion. No one flinched at the sound anymore. It was part of the air, like the slow creak of the floorboards or the sigh of the wind outside that never quite made it into the room. The chimes rang out to no applause, no response, but they rang all the same. In a corner bedroom, a small round clock sat atop a dresser, its glass slightly fogged. Once, it had marked school mornings, departures, arrivals, the end of arguments, and the start of Sunday pancakes. But now it simply counted time because it didn't know how not to, even without eyes watching. It performed its task, its purpose inasmuch but persistent. Each tick was a soft drumbeat of something once vital now reduced, not quite dead, but quieted. The kind of quiet that gathers when a song has ended. But the room hasn't yet moved. There were wristwatches in drawers, ticking under piles of scarves or handkerchiefs. Some had stopped entirely, their gears resting in a kind of deep sleep. Others, miraculously, still moved, patient and trapped, their ticking too small to be heard unless pressed to the ear. They belonged to hands that no longer wore them. Their ticking wasn't for the wearer anymore, it was for the air, for the fabric, for the drawer. Their motion was not noticed, but it persisted, a small defiance against complete stillness. And still, the question lingered. What does a clock mean when no one needs to know what hour it is? Because it is not the numbers that carry weight, it is the context, the meaning, the need. And here, in this place where clocks continued to tick and time continued to pass, nothing rose to meet it. The days bled into one another with a softness that could hardly be distinguished. Morning did not differ much from afternoon, and night arrived not with drama, but with a slow dimming, a gentle unspooling of light. Meals happened when they happened, not by schedule, but by rhythm. Sleep came not at a set hour, but when the eyes could no longer hold the world open. And waking, too, was a matter of drifting back toward awareness without obligation. The clocks ticked, but no alarm sounded, no appointments loomed. There was no too late or just in time. There was only now, again and again, and the steady beat of seconds that no longer marked anything worth hurrying toward. In that way, the clocks were ghost echoes of an urgency that had long since moved on. They reminded the space of what it used to mean to care about time, of the rushing, the measuring, the counting down. They remembered schedules like a body remembers a song it hasn't heard in years. And though those memories had faded from the minds of those who lived among them, the clock still carried them, still whispered them quietly into the background with every tick. "It's 3:05, they'd say, though no one asked. "It's 9:43. It's time for something." But nothing came. And yet, there was something beautiful in it, to this disconnection from measurement, from urgency, from the tyranny of clocks. There was freedom in the meaninglessness. Without deadlines, without expectations, time became softer, like fabric allowed to relax after being stretched too long. A minute could be an hour. A day could pass like steam from a kettle there, then gone. There was no punishment for missing a moment, because no moment was marked as more important than the next. And so, in that space, the clocks became more like lullabies, background hums, gentle reminders not of what must be done, but of the quiet persistence of existence itself. Tick, tick, tick. The sound became almost like breathing, like the gentle beat of a heart in sleep, not commanding, not sharp, but steady, familiar. It was the room's way of letting you know you were still in it. That life, however subdued, continued. That time, even stripped of appointments and goals, still offered motion, still offered rhythm. Even when meaning had left the building, the rhythm remained. Perhaps, in another room, there was a calendar with pages that hadn't been turned. A clock above it still ticked faithfully. The two no longer spoke the same language. The calendar had given up. The clock had not. But even the stubbornness of ticking became, over time, a kind of kindness. It said, "You are here." It said, "Another second has passed." It said, even without purpose, "I am with you." And that mattered, even if only in the softest, smallest way. The hands of these clocks kept chasing one another in endless loops, not out of hope, but out of habit. There was no finish line to reach, No celebratory bell at midnight. No dawning sense of arrival. Just ticking. Just turning. Just persistence. And maybe, for someone in the space, someone who wandered from room to room without needing to be anywhere, in particular, the sound became a comfort. It was not silence, and it was not speech. It was a kind of anchor, tying the present moment to the next with a thread so thin you could only feel it if you were very still. There is a grace in things that continue even when they are no longer needed. A generosity in the ticking of a clock that doesn't expect applause. A gentleness in machines that keep time not because it matters, but because it is what they were made for. They are not sad. They are not frustrated. They are simply present, a kind of mechanical faith. And in this house or room, or hallway, or waiting place where time has become soft and slow and slightly out of focus, the clocks provide a heartbeat, not a demand, but a reassurance. Time does not need to mean anything to pass. It will pass anyway, and maybe that is the meaning in the end. Because meaning isn't always in the counting, it's in the noticing. And if you are quiet enough, still enough, you may begin to hear the clocks not as reminders of appointments missed or opportunities lost, but as soft-spoken friends whispering gently, "You're still here. The moment is still unfolding. You don't have to rush. Just be. And perhaps that is enough."
It began not with an absence of sound, but with the weight of something unspoken or quiet, that crept not only into corners but between walls, across floors, and through the very structure of the house, until it was no longer just a condition of the air, but a presence unto itself. This silence did not arrive abruptly, nor did it demand recognition. It merely unfurled, slowly and patiently, like a long ribbon being unspooled through the spaces between doorways and ceilings and stair rails, threading itself gently through the gaps left behind by conversation, laughter, footsteps, or arguments long settled into memory. It was not hostile nor mournful, it had no bitterness in it. If anything, it was considerate, like someone removing their shoes, so as not to wake a sleeping guest. But it was thorough, and it was real, and it had been growing for some time, without anyone marking its beginning. It stretched from the bedroom, where the curtains remained drawn, not out of grief but simply because the effort of opening them had quietly been dismissed as unnecessary. It moved through the hallway where once photos had been dusted weekly, and now gathered a fine coating of settled air. It wrapped itself around the armchair where no one now sat, though once it had been the seat of daily ritual, the morning newspaper, the afternoon sigh, and the evening settling of bones. It lay across the rug in the study, the one that used to be rumpled with use, but now lay smooth and undisturbed, its threads no longer catching crumbs or pet hair or any of the daily traces of movement. The silence drifted through the kitchen, which had grown strangely immaculate over time, not because anyone was scrubbing it meticulously, but because there had been no mess to clean, no teacups left forgotten by the kettle, no spoons balanced precariously on saucers, no half-cut lemons, no toast crumbs. The fridge still hummed, yes, but softer now, as if even the machine had picked up on the hush that blanketed the space. Doors were no longer opened with purpose, but rather nudged and forgotten, left ajar with no one to notice. Cabinets held items still within reach but untouched, preserved, not in reverence, but in a kind of suspended intention. The silence stretched between the rooms like a breath held too long, a hesitation that became its language, one that didn't require translation, because there was no one left to misinterpret it. It passed through the threshold of the dining room, where a table remained set for a meal that had once been routine. 4 places, then 3, then 2, until at last the habit of setting anything at all had simply faded. The chairs still faced one another, though now their dialogue was imagined, composed of glances that never arrived and stories that were no longer told. A napkin remained folded one corner, slightly curled on. The light that fell through the narrow window illuminated the space, just as it had always done. But now the golden hour touched only stillness. It cast long, contemplative shadows instead of dancing across conversation. And beyond that room, the silence continued into the stairwell, where the creak of a single step once betrayed the movements of early risers or late wanderers, now remaining mute, as though the wood too had forgotten how to speak. Upstairs, the silence gathered more thickly, In the bedroom it hovered just above the floorboards, resting on the indent of a pillow that had not been folded around the soft curve of a blanket that still bore the imprint of someone once curled within it. Drawers sat slightly ajar, as though someone had reached in for a scarf or a handkerchief, but then thought better of it. The wardrobe doors no longer swung with the same small click they once did. They stayed still now, keeping company with garments that waited with quiet dignity. And in the room at the end of the hall, where once a desk sat facing the light, paper and pen remained in quiet communion. The pen had not run dry, but the need to write had faded. The silence there was thick with almost words phrases that hovered just beneath articulation, like dreams upon waking, just out of reach. And so the silence grew between rooms, not as a void, not as an emptiness, but as a presence, a tapestry woven from all the things that no longer needed saying. It held within it the rhythm of daily life that had once passed through these rooms like wind through open doors, mornings with clinking dishes, afternoons marked by footsteps across tiles, evenings warmed by the murmur of voices that rose and fell like a tide. Now, the silence remembered them all. It held them tenderly, gently, not as ghosts or echoes, but as softened impressions, footprints that had not yet faded entirely. It didn't accuse the house of abandonment. Rather, it whispered back to each room a promise of having witnessed it all. And when one did speak on occasion, when a word escaped the lips of the last inhabitant like a forgotten habit, like there, or yes, or simply a name spoken into the middle distance, the silence didn't recoil. It received the sound, carried it gently to the next room, tucked it beneath the cushions, and folded it into the pleats of the curtain. It let the word rest where it could be safe. The silence knew the difference between solitude and loneliness. It knew that presence wasn't always loud, that care could be expressed in the way a lamp remained unturned, or how a door was always left unlocked, just in case. It knew that some days passed entirely between two rooms, the bedroom and the kitchen, and that those days could still be whole, even if they were not filled with company or noise. The silence between rooms was not the kind one escaped from. It was the kind one grew into. It stretched, yes, but not like something being pulled thin, more like something being softened and spread until it became a second skin, until it became the natural state of things. Sometimes it was a comfort like the hush of snowfall, like the pause between heartbeats when you are listening very closely. Other times, it was a presence too large to name, something that felt like memory and longing and contentment and ache all braided into one breathless moment. But it was never empty. The silence stretched between rooms because it had learned to fill the space where people once were, where voices once tangled with light and routine once held shape. It was the silence of a life still being lived, even if lived slowly. It did not demand productivity, it did not rush grief, and it did not shame idleness. It simply existed, spreading gently from room to room like early morning fog, like the scent of something cooking long ago, like the familiarity of footsteps long vanished but still remembered by the floorboards. And when, eventually, someone else might come into that house, open a door, step into the hallway, walk into a room, still holding the shape of a presence now past, the silence would not flee. It would make space. It would ease its weight. It would shift, quietly, to allow a new sound to enter. But until then, it would continue to stretch gently between the rooms, not as a sorrow, but as a thread of deep, enduring stillness, a reminder that even when no words are spoken, and no music is played, and no voices fill the air, the house remembers, the space holds, and the silence carries everything.
The room was quiet in a way that felt almost deliberate, as though the silence itself had stepped forward and filled the space, where sound might have been not aggressively, but gently, with the patience of something that had waited a long time to be noticed. It was the kind of quiet that didn't demand reverence but seemed to carry it anyway, like a sacred pause that no one had scripted, but everyone instinctively understood. There had once been music here. Not loud, not dramatic, but familiar, a song that didn't need lyrics to be recognized. A melody so soft and cyclical that it slipped past attention and became part of the walls, the furniture, and the very dust that floated lazily through shouts of late afternoon light. Not a tune that anyone had turned up, nor one that had ever been requested. It simply played, as if the room itself hummed it. It may have come from an old radio tucked behind a row of books, or a record player with a slightly wobbling needle, or perhaps not from a device at all, but from the way life, when lived quietly and with repetition, sometimes takes on the rhythm of a song. The song had not stopped abruptly. No one had risen to turn it off. There had been no skipping of tracks, no click of a power switch, and no hiss as the needle lifted. It had just ended, so subtly that no one could say when exactly it had gone. It had played so long, for so many days and hours and subtle moments, that its absence didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a breath held a little longer than usual, or a thought that stopped just short of becoming a sentence. The silence it left behind was not hollow, not aching or sharp. It was full, somehow, of what had once been. The absence of the song became a presence of its own, a soft echo, not in the ears, but in the air. Like the ghost of a breeze that had moved the curtains just enough to be remembered. The room still seemed to expect the melody, in a way. The chair by the window still tilted slightly toward the source of sound that no longer played. The small rug in the center still bore the crease from where someone used to sit, knees tucked, maybe humming along without realizing. The book on the table was still open to a page no longer being read, as though the music had once accompanied its lines, and had made the act of reading less about absorbing and more about being present. The plants on the sill didn't lean, but they stood in quiet agreement with the absence, as if the songs not playing were something natural, a kind of seasonal change rather than an ending. The clock ticked, but even it seemed subdued. Its rhythm softened, not quite syncopated, but more hesitant, like it was listening for something it once moved in time with. And still, no music came. Not because it couldn't, but because it didn't need to. The same song not playing was not a lack, it was a memory. A comfort that no longer needed repetition to be felt. The mind remembered how it sounded without calling it forward. The way you remember the weight of someone's hand without needing to see it again. The air held it, the walls held it, and the room lived in the shape of where it had once been. Outside the window, a tree moved faintly in the breeze, its leaves not dancing but swaying. In time with something not heard, but still deeply understood. A bird landed on the ledge, looked in, and moved on. Even the sky outside the glass looked softer, as if the sun itself had lowered its voice in respect. The same song not playing was, in this way, its own kind of music. It was the after sound, the hum in the bones that remains long after the note ends. No one entered the room expecting to hear it anymore. They came in and sat and sometimes tilted their heads for a moment, not in confusion, but in recognition of what wasn't there. It was the silence that belongs only to songs that have been loved into memory, not missed, but folded into the fabric of things. If a new song had started, perhaps it would have been rejected not because it was wrong, but because it was too new, too present. The quiet was now tuned to the key of remembering. The same song not playing had created a kind of stillness that made people breathe slower, speak less, and sit longer. It became the tempo of the space, a measured stillness that didn't insist but invited. The furniture had settled into it. The books had stopped closing themselves. Even the light bulb in the floor lamp, once prone to flickering, now glowed steadily. As though reluctant to interrupt, there had been words once sung or whispered or written in, even though they were no longer heard. They were understood, still gently echoing in the way the room's corners curved and how the dust fell. A visitor might notice something missing but not feel disturbed by it. It was the sort of absence that explained itself without needing to be explained. A comfortable quiet where no apology lived. And in that space, the not playing song became something truer than a melody. It became a rhythm of memory, a presence of absence that didn't ache or long, but simply was like a favorite sweater, folded neatly in a drawer untouched, but still warming in its own way. Time passed, not with noise or milestones, but with softness. The light dimmed toward evening. The room cooled without chill. Somewhere in another part of the house, something may have stirred, a kettle boiling, a drawer closing, but here, the same song continued not to play. It did so perfectly, without interruption or effort. The silence was full of the tale of dust motes that swirled in golden light of a cup, with a ring of tea dried to its rim, of a forgotten scarf draped over a chair's arm of floorboards. that still remembered footsteps even if they no longer sounded them out. The song's absence was in the hush between small things. It was not silence in protest. It was silence in peace. And the room held it the way one holds a breath, not in fear of loss, but in honor of what once was and what still lingered, even without a sound. In a room where time had long since settled like dust in the corners, and light filtered in without urgency, there were shadows that moved without cause, shapes that curled at the base of furniture, and along the seam where wall met floor, flickering and sliding as if attached to something just out of sight. Only there was nothing there. No figure to cast them, no source to claim them, and yet they returned day after day, soft as breath, and persistent as memory, always arriving before questions could be asked, and lingering long after any light that might have justified them had faded. They were not frightening, not quite, more curious than ominous, as though they were waiting for someone to remember where they had come from, or perhaps who they once belonged to. And in their silent persistence, they began to feel less like accidents of light and more like guests, forgotten ones, who remained even when the gathering had long ended. The tea cooled, the chairs emptied, the conversations just a whisper of air in the curtains, and though no one claimed them, they slipped in and out of corners as if mapping something lost, drawing quiet lines across the floor, past the legs of chairs and the folds of drapes, tracing paths that made no sense to those who still tried to explain the world with logic and light bulbs. For these shadows did not obey such rules. They appeared on sunless days, stretching calmly beneath unlit sconces, curling over closed books, resting their formless hands atop window sills that hadn't been opened in years. And no matter how many times the rugs were cleaned or the floorboards swept, or the lamps repositioned, they came back, not identical, not repeated, but related, as if each one was a whisper of something once real, now drifting between presence and memory. And though people occasionally tried to ignore them, they always noticed. And the way you notice a figure at the corner of your eye and find only an empty chair when you turn. And the way you feel watched not by malice, but by something that once knew your name. Something that still lingers, not to haunt, but to remember. And so the room grew quieter, not out of fear, but reverence, as though everyone who stepped inside understood they were sharing the space with something that could not be touched or truly known, only respected. And though the shadows never spoke, never gave clear sign of purpose or identity, their silence had a shape, a weight, a dignity. And when the wind shifted and dust danced in the beams of late afternoon light, you could almost see them pause, gathering themselves like folds in an old coat, briefly more defined before dissolving again into nothing. And it made people wonder if these shadows were not cast by bodies, then were they cast by thoughts? By regrets, by moments held too long and never let go? Were they the outlines of things left unsaid, of doors unopened, letters unwritten, footsteps that stopped at the edge of decision and never crossed over? Perhaps they were the shape of a sigh someone once meant to release, or the silhouette of a goodbye that had never been spoken, and now they roamed without anchor, tethered to nothing, searching still for the moment they were born from. And so the people who lived around them learned to step lightly, not from fear, but out of quiet acknowledgement, leaving chairs slightly askew, not drawing the curtains, to suddenly pausing before turning off the last light, as if to say, yes, we see you too, not with eyes, but with something slower, something older than vision. And in return, the shadows remained gentle, never aggressive, never sharp-edged or harsh, just present, like echoes without sound, like memories too tired to explain themselves. Over time, they became part of the room's rhythm, as natural as the ticking of the old clock, as expected as the creak of the floorboard near the hallway, comforting. Even in their soft, persistent sand, some began to believe they were not mistakes of light at all, but rather the place's memory expressing itself, a kind of language spoken in tone and shade, in presence without proof. And others said perhaps the shadows were promises, old ones never fulfilled, still waiting patiently to be honored, hovering not to accuse but to remind, not to claim ownership but to bear witness to what had once mattered deeply enough to remain, even when form had faded, even when name had been forgotten. And though no one ever tried to explain them too loudly, the house began to feel different. Not heavy, but full, like a story still being told in the pauses between words. And in that fullness, in that hushed continuity, the shadows seemed to settle, not to disappear, but to rest. Perhaps content to be seen, however quietly, however briefly, for what they were. Not darkness, not tricks of the eye, but traces of something tender that had chosen, for reasons it didn't need to justify, to stay. The light entered the room as if it had forgotten the rules, as if time had not briefed it before arrival, as if clocks had never ticked nor hours ever been named, and because of that, it wandered freely, unmoored and untamed. It spilled over the edge of the window frame in a quiet confusion, golden in places, silver in others, as though it hadn't chosen a mood yet, as though it was still deciding what kind of day to be. It pulled in corners that hadn't seen light in weeks, cast itself onto shelves where it did not belong, lit up books that hadn't been opened in years, and touched the surface of still water in a glass, as though it were curious to see what reflection it might find there. It was not the light of morning, fresh and eager, nor the heavy, amber light of late afternoon that sighs across the floor. It was something in between, or perhaps beside. Something that shimmered with a feeling of being out of place but not unwanted. The room, caught off guard, did not quite know how to hold it. The shadows retreated but did not vanish. The walls glowed but did not warm. Even the dust motes, floating like silent witnesses in the air, seemed puzzled by the way the light behaved, drifting sideways when they expected down, shimmering faintly in a tone, not quite gold, not quite white. It was as if the sky had loosened its grip, and what spilled through the window pane was memory instead of sunlight, a gentle recollection of brightness rather than brightness itself. No one checked the clock. No one asked what time it was, because to ask would be to disrupt whatever strange peace had arrived with the light. The house, accustomed to the routine of time meals at 1 hour, curtains drawn at another, now held its breath, suspended in a moment that refused to belong to any particular point in the day. The light curled around objects gently, as though apologizing for arriving without warning, without context. It did not rush, nor did it fade. It simply remained, slowly moving, not by the sun, but with something internal and forgotten. Some secret tempo buried beneath years of measured minutes and structured schedules. A chair beneath the window, often unnoticed, glowed with quiet importance, as though it had been waiting for just this kind of illumination to finally be seen. The creases in an old blanket caught the light at strange angles, casting small and silent hills of brightness over softness that no longer remembered its shape. A picture frame on the wall reflected a beam that didn't match the angle it should have come from. The photograph inside it, faded now, was brightened for the first time in ages, its faces blinking as though woken up from a nap they didn't know they were taking. The air itself felt thick with something unnamed, like the moment before a thought forms, or the edge of a dream that has not yet declared whether it is real or not. There was no certainty in this light, only a suggestion. It hinted at late morning but carried the coolness of dusk. It lit the ceiling as if it were noon, but softened the floor like twilight. The plants on the windowsill, usually so attuned to the sun's language, tilted their heads uncertainly, unsure whether to stretch upward or remain still. Even the ticking of the clock on the wall, regular, confident, always certain, sounded more hesitant now, as if aware of its irrelevance in this hourless glow. Outside, the world may have gone on, cars moving, people answering calls, deadlines being met, but inside this room, time had misstepped, and the light had wandered in through the space left behind. And with that wandering came a stillness too complete to be accidental, a hush that was not imposed, but accepted. No one in the house moved to correct it. No one pulled the curtain. No switch was flipped. There was an understanding unspoken, instinctive, that this light, whatever it was, however long it stayed, was not to be questioned, because to question it would be to tether it, to drag it back into the machinery of hours and roles and expectations. And some lights are not meant to serve. Some lights are only meant to be visited the pages of an open book, fluttered slightly under its warmth not because of a breeze, but because the light seemed to breathe. It touched the edge of a teacup and turned the liquid inside to amber, then backed away as though it had only wanted a look. It made its way to the baseboards and rested there, turning dust into gold, cobwebs into threadbare lace. It wasn't trying to beautify, it was just being, and in being, it transformed. The person in the room, quiet, seated, wrapped in a cardigan that had faded over many seasons, did not react with surprise. They looked up once, perhaps, then let their gaze fall again, not out of disinterest, but out of recognition. This wasn't the first time the light had forgotten itself. It had happened before, in other moments of dislocation, grief, maybe, or peace so deep it blurred the lines. Moments when the world slipped its gears and something softer slipped in. And so they let it happen. They did not name the time. They did not name the day. They simply allowed the light to stay. And as it stayed, the room itself seemed to shift not in place or structure, but in feel. As though it had aged differently than it should have, or remembered something it hadn't thought about in decades. The air was thick with that memory of years that weren't marked by calendars, but by chairs sat in and windows looked out of and cups warmed between the still hands. In this light, everything felt like it had happened before, not in repetition, but in familiarity. A familiarity older than language. It was the kind of light that belonged to neither sunrise nor sunset, but to the space in between, the forgotten middle, where nothing is demanded and everything just is. It was the color of reflection, not silver like a mirror, but muted, like a thought returning years after it first passed through. It was not about warmth or brightness. It was about presence, the kind of presence that doesn't arrive when summoned, but when invited by accident, through stillness, through waiting, through the long quiet of an ordinary day left unbroken. Eventually, the light began to shift, not because time pulled it, but because it chose to move. Its angles softened, its edges blurred. It crept up the walls like the end of a candle's glow, then fell gently into the corners, leaving behind not darkness, but a memory of illumination. The shadows returned not sharp, but whole, as if they had been waiting patiently just outside the door. The clock ticked again with more confidence. The fridge hummed back into rhythm. The world resumed its pacing. But for those few long, nameless minutes, the room had belonged to something else. Something outside of the countable. Something timeless, not because it lasted forever, but because while it lasted, it replaced the need for time altogether. And as night arrived with the soft inevitability of all endings, the room held a kind of afterglow. Not literal, not visible, but felt like the warmth left in a seat after someone stands, or the hush that remains in a church long after the singing stops. The person in the chair did not light another lamp. They simply sat there a little longer, eyes not closed, not open, but somewhere in between. Somewhere in that space, the light had touched. Somewhere in the moment that didn't belong to any clock. And when they rose, when the day continued, it did so not with fanfare, but with a memory of light. That didn't he know what time it was, light that asked for nothing, and gave everything simply by arriving when it wasn't expected and leaving before it had to be. Understood. It began again, not with a proclamation, not with clarity, but with a gentle shift that could barely be called a beginning. The morning arrived, or rather, it failed to fully leave. It unfolded in such a subdued and weightless manner that it was difficult to say exactly. When night had surrendered, one moment the room was simply dim, and the next, it was that soft kind of pale where nothing cast a real shadow. It was morning, supposedly, but which one, no one could say. There had been so many like it, quiet, folded in on themselves, hesitant to declare themselves new. This one bore no difference except in that it felt perhaps 1 degree more indistinct, as though the paint of time was smudging with each passing day, bleeding just slightly at the edges. The mug was in the same place, the curtain drawn just as it had been, the floor cool underfoot in the same way it always was at this hour, if one could call it an hour at all. It might have been 6 or 7 or 8:30, but it didn't matter. The clock ticked, but it no longer announced. It merely offered its numbers as trivia, and even though with less conviction. The ritual still happened, or at least the motions did. A kettle was filled, a stove clicked, and a chair was eased into not from exhaustion, but from habit. The body moved not because it was ready to meet the day, but because the day expected the shape of motion. Nothing demanded action, but the absence of demand had its own pull. There was no urgency, no particular reason to be awake, and yet here it was, another morning. The toast browned quietly, the butter softened without comment, and the spoon stirred whatever needed stirring with a rhythm that matched the breath of the room, slow, mechanical, disinterested. Nothing was wrong. Exactly. Nothing was right either. It was simply a day with no edge, no shape to lean against. Outside the window, the sky wore the same gentle gray it had the morning before, or had it been 3 mornings ago. There were no clouds to read, no light shifting through branches to inspire metaphor. The trees stood without rustling, without bird call. Even the leaves seemed reluctant to move. If it rained, it did so softly, invisibly, like a whisper you only notice after it's gone. And inside, the air was still. Not heavy, not stale, just still, as if waiting for something that would not come, and had already learned how not to mind the wait. One could look around the room and search for difference, for signs of time's passing. Perhaps a book had shifted slightly on the armrest, or a slipper had nudged an inch farther from the bed. But these were not markers of change, they were the slow, imperceptible drift of objects that no longer needed their places. Even the dust didn't settle in new patterns anymore. It simply existed, thinly spread across surfaces that had forgotten the last touch. The plants leaned toward the light like they always had, though no one had really watched them grow in weeks. Or had it been months? Time no longer arranged itself into stories. It had flattened into a soft hum of sameness, where even yesterday refused to stand out in memory. And so this morning, this particular morning, was one more ripple in a pond that had long since stopped moving. The body complied. It bathed, it dressed, and it consumed. But the mind wandered without anchor. There were no thoughts of yesterday's conversation or tomorrow's plan. There were no errands pressing against the spine, no emails demanding response, and no voices reminding one to act. Even memory began to slide. Did the milk run out last week, or the week before? Had the same song played yesterday, or was it always playing, subtly looping through the background like a scent to faint name? The morning resisted attention. It asked for no reflection and offered no novelty. It was not bleak, it was simply void of edges. Perhaps this morning was the softest one yet, not out of peace, nor out of sorrow, but from the way it failed to declare itself. It didn't rise with the promise of something ahead, nor did it drag the weight of regret. It just was. The hands on the clock moved, yes, but even they seemed uncertain of their task. The seconds passed like footsteps on carpet, soundless, directionless, more suggestion than fact. And in the quiet unfolding of this hourless day, the soul did not resist. It drifted slightly, untethered by obligation, cradled not by joy or despair, but by neutrality. Not numb, but dulled. A sleepwalk kind of awareness. Eyes open, but unfocused. Somewhere, someone was likely rushing, likely dressing children or running to catch a train or checking the time every few minutes as tasks stacked higher and higher. But not here. Here, the morning had made no requests. It had simply shown up and sat down beside you like someone who used to talk but now only listens. The pages of the newspaper remained folded. The phone, while charged, did not ring. Even the birds, once predictable in their morning declarations, had taken the day off. Or maybe they were singing and you had just stopped noticing. That was the way of things now when the world wore the same face every day. The features began to blur. And there was no protest in it, no rage at monotony, just a slow acceptance, the way water accepts the shape of whatever it fills. You, too, had begun to take the shape of these mornings, slow, rounded, indistinct. Once, you marked the days by something, an appointment, a headline, a memory. Now, You marked them by the color of your socks, by the level of light coming through the blinds, and by the angle of your hand when you reached for the mug. And even those markers faded. It wasn't forgetting, it was fading, as if the importance of keeping track had simply evaporated. One might call it loneliness, but it wasn't quite that. It was more like not belonging, not removed from others, but removed from motion, from relevance. The world kept moving elsewhere, surely, but here, it remained suspended like a room filled with snow that never melts. And in that hush, morning arrived like all the rest, gentle, vague, and indifferent to attention. It bore no announcement. It did not ask to be written about. It was not sad. It was not lovely. It was simply another. And so it came. It stayed, and eventually, it would leave folded back into the soft layers of mornings just like it, barely distinguishable, barely remembered, barely missed. And maybe that's the strange beauty of it all, that time can pass without being shaped by memory. That a person can live through day after day without story, without spectacle, and still somehow exist. The pulse does not quicken. The air does not shift. The room does not cry out. But still, you breathe. Still, the kettle boils. Still, the light changes, even if only by a fraction. Still, this morning passed less distinct than the last, perhaps, but no less real. It was part of a quiet chronology known only to the space that held it. It was another soft brushstroke on a canvas that will never be shown, never signed. But still it was. It lay there quietly, folded once, not twice, not tucked into an envelope, just folded with the gentle certainty of something that knew it had waited long enough to be touched, but not quite enough to be sent. The ink faded, though still legible, had softened at the edges, where the loops of letters had once been written with purpose measured, deliberate strokes of a hand that had taken its time, as though each word needed to earn its place on the page. And yet, for all the care, for all the weight that the message must have once carried, the letter bore no date, not at the top, not beneath the salutation, not even scribbled in a rush corner as an afterthought. It was a letter without a timestamp, without the boundaries of a specific season or moment or hour. It floated free of time, in a way most things did not. Most things, after all, could be traced. The smell of bread baking in a kitchen once busy with morning chores. The creak of floorboards that had memorized the pace of certain footsteps. The way light fell differently, through the same window depending on whether it was spring or autumn. But not this letter. This letter did not declare its time of origin. It resisted being tethered to chronology, choosing instead to simply exist, half whispered, half held, somewhere between the intention to send and the decision to keep. It might have been written in the thick of a winter when the days passed more like molasses than minutes, or maybe it belonged to a summer, penned in the hush of late evening, with the windows open and the smell of jasmine hanging in the air like an old tune. Perhaps it came from a time of great change, or from a moment when nothing had changed at all, when the rhythm of ordinary life had slowed just enough to notice what the heart had been carrying all along. The letter's words, tender but not fragile, gave away just enough to make the reader lean closer. They did not beg for attention. They did not plead. They simply stated, with a gentle candor, things that had once mattered, not dramatic declarations, but the kind that lived in smallness, a mention of a scarf left behind, a recipe shared but never cooked, the way the sky had looked one day when a conversation ended too soon. There was no clear subject, no one event that explained its existence, and yet the letter did not feel empty. It felt full in a quiet way, like a drawer filled with objects whose significance was known only to one person, and yet still demanded to be kept. There was a name at the top written in that careful hand, almost hesitant, and then the rest followed, not in paragraphs but in something closer to spoken thought, as if the writer had paused, often unsure of what they were truly trying to say. And maybe that's why the letter was never dated. Maybe the writer wasn't sure what the letter was meant to be. Maybe they wrote it because something inside them needed to be outside for a while, something unspoken, something between apology and remembrance, something not quite worthy of postage, yet too meaningful to be discarded. Or perhaps they feared that giving it a date would also give it a deadline, and would make it belong to a moment that could then pass and be closed. This letter refused that. It wanted to remain open, not like a question, but like a door left ajar, just enough for someone to return through if they chose to. And so, undated, it rested in a drawer for years, or perhaps only weeks. Among things that people save when they're not sure what they'll need to remember later. A photograph of someone smiling, and out of focus. A button that belonged to no known shirt. A list of books never borrowed. Things that mean something because they once meant something, and the letter remained, absorbing the scent of cedar and linen and air untouched by visitors. This did not disrespect it, it settled softly around it, as if acknowledging that even paper needed time to rest. Sometimes, someone would stumble upon the letter, not always the same person, and unfold it, not looking for revelation, but for atmosphere. They would read the first few lines, or perhaps only the name at the top, and then fold it again with a reverence reserved for memories that didn't belong to them, but still felt important. And in that way, the letter continued to live, not loudly, not publicly, but like a lantern hidden in a cupboard, quietly glowing for those who knew to open the door. It didn't matter if it had been written 10 years ago or yesterday. It asked nothing of time. Its words were not urgent. They did not expire. They waited with the kind of patience that comes only when one has released expectation. It could have been a goodbye, or it might have been a beginning never acted upon. Maybe it was simply an observation that no longer had a place to land. But the lack of a date freed it from needing to explain itself. It was, quite simply, presence on paper, something that had once been inside someone and was now outside, folded, weightless but filled. The room it lived in grew older, as all rooms do. The paint on the walls deepened into a shade that could no longer be named. The curtains faded in the places where light insisted on touching them. The clock on the mantel ticked slower, not because the gears had broken, but because there was no longer anyone checking it. But the letter remained constant. Its ink did not run. Its creases did not weaken. It had made peace with its place, not in the world, but in the space between intent and act. It did not mourn being unread. It did not ask to be found. It simply was, as some truths are quiet, undated, and whole. And when, years from now, the drawer is finally empty by someone who doesn't recognize the handwriting or the name or the significance, it's possible the letter will be set aside for a moment, puzzled over, and then tucked into a book for safekeeping, not because it holds secrets, but because it feels like it might. Not because it demands understanding, but because it has the calm gravity of something that was once urgent and no longer is. And even then, without a date, it will not age. It will remain what it always was, a message caught in the stillness between one heart and the world, timeless not in grandeur, but in its quiet refusal to end. The blanket rested on the arm of the chair, the way some things do when they are no longer in use. But not forgotten, folded, not with care so much as with familiarity, a kind of quiet knowing, a simple gesture done out of habit rather than intention, and left there not as a symbol but because it seemed like the right place at the time, and there had been no reason to move it since. The fabric was soft though not delicate, textured with years of use and slightly pilled from having warmed shoulders and covered knees, and curled around someone's side during long nights when the wind pressed against the windows. Like a visitor unsure whether to knock, it smelled faintly of the room, of closed books and tea once poured, of sun that had filtered through the curtains and rested gently on the back of the chair, and perhaps still carried a trace of the last body it had touched, a ghost of warmth, now cooled into memory. Its pattern, once brighter, had settled into a muted, familiar blur, stripes or florals or squares that had long since become part of the background, as easily ignored as the ticking of a quiet clock. No one could say exactly when it had last been used. It might have been a week, or it might have been a year. Time had grown soft here, not absent, not gone, just blurred at the edges, like watercolor on damp paper, where the distinction between yesterday and a long time ago didn't matter quite so much. The blanket had not been placed there for show. It was not folded in the way decorators do, no corners pinched. No careful drape, but in the way someone does when they rise from rest and feel no need to put everything away properly. Folded once, maybe twice, enough to be neat without being formal, a shape made by living, not by arranging. No one had touched it since, and yet it didn't seem neglected. It had a presence, the blanket, as though it still remembered its last purpose. It had not gone limp with disuse. It held its folds like someone holds a memory, not tightly, but faithfully, like something waiting without impatience, without demand. People walk past it sometimes. They noticed it only in the way one notices the things that are always there, half seen, half remembered, part of the quiet landscape of home. Perhaps someone had once meant to use it again. Perhaps they paused beside it, even reached out a hand, and then let their fingers hover just above the fabric before deciding against it. Not because they didn't want it, but because they didn't need it just then. And maybe because its stillness felt too complete to disturb. After all, it looked right there, as though it belonged not only to the chair, but to the air around it, to the room's gentle breath. The chair beneath it bore the slight imprint of time as well as sunken cushion. A faint shine where hands had gripped its arms and together. The two seemed to understand one another. The chair, always waiting to hold someone. The blanket, always waiting to warm. But neither pressed their purpose. The room itself was quiet, not in a lonely way, but in the way that happens when things are allowed to be still without being abandoned. Light came in through the window softly, the kind of light that doesn't seek to illuminate so much as to rest. It settled on the blanket's fold, casting the faintest shadow into its creases, as though light, too, understood how to wait. Dust floated in the air, but didn't settle, just moved gently, almost thoughtfully, like the memory of a breeze. Somewhere, maybe in another room, a clock ticked, but its rhythm didn't reach here. If the blanket had been moved, if someone had lifted it and wrapped it around themselves again, it would have warmed easily, its fibers remembering the shape of a shoulder, the bend of an elbow. But it was content not to be used. It had no urgency. It did not sag in disappointment. It waited the way stones wait beside a path, not with longing, but with patience, with the quiet faith that everything has its moment and that some moments, even if they never come again, were enough. There is something beautiful in things left undisturbed, not because they're precious, but because they've earned the right to simply be. The blanket was like that. It had seen enough evenings. It had heard enough stories read aloud. It had felt enough fingertips smoothing its edge, tugging it closer, bunching it in sleep. Its threads had pulled slightly in places where rings had caught or where restless toes had pushed. It had been part of cold mornings and long afternoons and nights that asked nothing except quiet companionship. And now, folded here, it carried all that without asking for recognition. Sometimes, when the room was empty, a breeze might stir from a window slightly cracked, and the edge of the blanket might lift, not quite unfold, not quite move, but hint, as if it still remembered motion. Then it would settle again, without drama, like a sigh halfway forgotten. If anyone thought to ask, they wouldn't be able to say why the blanket hadn't been used again, only that it hadn't seemed to need using. Other blankets had come and gone, been pulled from cupboards and draped over laps, tucked around children, thrown over shoulders during a sudden chill. But this particular blanket stayed folded, not out of reverence, not because it was special, but because its moment seemed to have completed itself. And yet it lingered, present, gentle, entirely without regret. Perhaps someone had loved it once. Perhaps someone had wrapped themselves in it during a long cry or a quiet joy, or simply because the world had felt heavy and warmth had seemed like the only answer. And maybe that someone wasn't here now, not gone, not far, just elsewhere. And the blanket, like so many small objects that live with us, carried the shape of that someone still, not in scent or mark, but in being, a kind of presence without presence. And if one were to unfold it, if one were to lift its edge and let it spill open across their lap, they might find nothing extraordinary. Just a blanket, just fabric, just threads and softness and a slight weight. But if they sat long enough, if they breathed in the stillness that had settled into its folds, they might feel something more. Not a memory exactly, not a story, but a sense that here was something that had been there when it mattered, and now remained because it had nothing left to prove. The room did not rush the blanket. The world did not ask it to move, and so it stayed, folded, from a week ago or a year. Time passed differently around it, respectfully, loosely. The clock might have ticked, the light might have shifted, the seasons may have changed their shoes, and walked by the windows again and again. But the blanket stayed the same, unchanged in its stillness, unchanged in its readiness, not waiting to be used, but waiting in the way. Old friends do not with impatience, but with trust that someone might come back, or not, and either way, it would remain. They were tucked into boxes lined with tissue, or slid gently between the brittle pages of albums that no longer open all the way, or framed and perched on mantels where the dust took more care than hands ever could. Photographs that once captured something crisp and clear, something that felt like a moment frozen in glass, but which, over the years, had begun to soften. Not in the paper itself, but in the faces, as if time had found a way to erase, not violently, but with a tender touch, the same way the sea rounds the edges of what it carries for long enough. And at first, you'd think it was the ink fading, or the exposure changing, or the simple chemical unraveling of age. But if you look closely and not with the hurried glance of someone seeking recognition, but with the patience of someone willing to sit and wait, you notice that what had faded most wasn't the background or the clothing or the lines of the frame, but the expressions, the fine details of mouth and eye and brow, the parts that held not just appearance but emotion, as though the feelings had quietly stepped back, letting the image become less exact, less insistent, more like memory and less like proof. The smiles lost their sharpness and became murmurs of joy instead of declarations. The gazes that once looked directly at the camera now seemed to turn inward or beyond, toward something unseen. And in this gentle softening, the people in the pictures began to seem less like themselves and more like the idea of them, the trace of a presence rather than a record of it. And somehow that made the photographs feel more alive. Not less, as if the act of forgetting detail made room for feeling, for atmosphere, for the way you remembered someone when you weren't trying too hard to remember them exactly, just truly. And the rooms where these photographs sat took on that same quiet, that same blur of time. The kind of stillness where clocks keep ticking but no one minds when the chimes are missed. Sometimes the faces seemed to smile more than they once had, sometimes less, depending on the hour and the light and the heart of the person looking. And in that ambiguity was a strange, serene permission not to forget, but to let go of precision, to allow love and loss to coexist in the same fading frame. Some noticed that the faces softened fastest on the photographs most often handled, as though the touch of longing fingers wore down the details like water on stone, or as though the images, sensing they were cherished, decided to meet memory halfway, surrendering their outlines to the more forgiving truths of affection rather than fact. And over time, those photographs no longer felt like documents but like dreams, paper thin, fragile with purpose, held not to study but to feel, to breathe with. A photograph once taken in haste, a child in motion, a mother distracted, a grandparent blinking the slowly now became a kind of poem in silver and gray, where the exact shape of a jaw no longer mattered, where the distance between pupils or the tilt of a chin became less important than the mood, the light, the hush behind the eyes, and perhaps that was the truest kind of portrait. After all, not the fixed frozen truth of a camera's shutter, but the version memory keeps reshaping in the silence afterward, and in some cases, faces softened so much that they blurred altogether, became clouds of light and shadow, and yet no one threw them away, for by then, the picture had stopped needing to show the person and had instead become of them, of their presence, their importance, the space they once took up, and the way they still echoed in rooms and in gestures, and in sentences people began without knowing why. Children would ask who that was, And the answers were stories, not names. And even when names were given, they carried less weight than the way someone said, "She used to hum that song while folding laundry," or "He always tapped the table twice before standing up," and suddenly the photo was full again. Not with face, but with life, with detail too soft for ink and paper. And so it made sense that the image would follow suit, becoming not sharper, but gentler. So the eye would not cling to exactness, but float in feeling. And the hands holding these images would do so with reverence. Not because they showed everything clearly, but because they held just enough to bring someone back, not fully, not exactly, but truly. And in a world obsessed with clarity, with resolution, with the sharp edges of high definition, there was something profoundly human in these photos that refused to stay crisp. Something wholly even about the way they yielded to time, and how the yielding made them more than they had been, more than evidence, more than record, becoming instead a kind of echo you could touch. A doorway not to the past itself, but to the way the past felt when it was still happening. And that, perhaps, was the most anyone could ever ask from a photo, not to keep someone perfectly still in a moment, long gone, but to let the moment keep breathing, quietly, gently, in the hands of whoever chose to hold it again. They were tucked into boxes lined with tissue or slid gently between the brittle pages of albums that no longer opened all the way, or framed and perched on mantels where the dust took more care than hands ever could. Photographs that once captured something crisp and clear, something that felt like a moment frozen in glass, but which, over the years, had begun to soften, not in the paper itself, but in the faces. As if time had found a way to erase, not violently, but with a tender touch, the same way the sea rounds the edges of what it carries for long enough. And at first, you think it was the ink fading, or the exposure changing, or the simple chemical unraveling of age. But if you look closely, and not with a hurried glance of someone seeking recognition, but with the patience of someone willing to sit and wait, you notice that what had faded most wasn't the background, or the clothing, or the lines of the frame, but the expressions, the fine details of mouth and eye and brow, the parts that held not just appearance but emotion, as though the feelings had quietly stepped back, letting the image become less exact, less insistent, more like memory and less like proof. The smiles lost their sharpness and became murmurs of joy instead of declarations. The gazes that once looked directly at the camera now seemed to turn inward, or beyond, towards something unseen. And in this gentle softening, the people in the pictures began to seem less like themselves and more like the idea of them, the trace of a presence rather than a record of it, and somehow that made the photographs feel more alive. Not less, as if the act of forgetting detail made room for feeling, for atmosphere, for the way you remembered someone when you weren't trying too hard to remember them exactly, just truly. And the rooms where these photographs sat took on that same quiet, that same blur of time, the kind of stillness where clocks keep ticking but no one minds when the chimes are missed. Sometimes the faces seemed to smile more than they once had, sometimes less, depending on the hour and the light and the heart of the person looking. And in that ambiguity was a strange, serene permission not to forget, but to let go of precision, to allow love and loss to coexist in the same fading frame. Some noticed that the faces softened fastest on the photographs most often handled, as though the touch of longing fingers wore down the details like water on stone, or as though the images, sensing they were cherished, decided to meet memory halfway, surrendering their outlines to the more forgiving truths of affection rather than fact. And over time, those photographs no longer felt like documents but like dreams, paper thin, fragile with purpose, held not to study but to feel, to breathe with. A photograph once taken in haste, a child in motion, a mother distracted, a grandparent blinking too slowly, now became a kind of poem in silver and gray, where the exact shape of a jaw no longer mattered, where the distance between pupils or the tilt of a chin became less important than the mood, the light, the hush behind the eyes. And perhaps that was the truest kind of portrait after all, not the fixed, frozen truth of a camera's shutter, but the version memory keeps reshaping in the silence afterward, and in some cases, Faces softened so much that they blurred all together, became clouds of light and shadow, and yet no one threw them away. For by then, the picture had stopped needing to show the person and had instead become of them, of their presence, their importance, the space they once took up, and the way they still echoed in rooms and in gestures and in sentences. People began without knowing why. Children would ask who that was, and the answers were stories, not names, and even when names were given, they carried less weight than the way someone said she used to hum that song while folding laundry, or he always tapped the table twice before standing up, and suddenly the photo was full again, not with face but with life, with detail too soft for ink and paper. And so it made sense that the image would follow suit, becoming not sharper but gentler. So the eye would not cling to exactness but float in feeling, and the hands holding these images would do so with reverence, not because they showed everything clearly, but because they held just enough to bring someone back, not fully, not exactly, but truly. And in a world obsessed with clarity, with resolution, with the sharp edges of high definition, there was something profoundly human in these photos that refused to stay crisp. Something wholly even about the way they yielded to time, and how the yielding made them more than they had been, more than evidence, more than record, becoming instead a kind of echo you could touch, a doorway not to the past itself but to the way the past felt when it was still happening. And that, perhaps, was the most anyone could ever ask from a photo, not to keep someone perfectly still in a moment, long gone, but to let the moment keep breathing, quietly, gently, in the hands of whoever chose to hold it again.